Hello, everyone, and welcome to the highly anticipated episode of the War Report, the 20th anniversary 9/11 special. Now, we've been teasing this for about a month now, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right into it. Of course, I
Right.
imagine all of you watching this know what happened on September 11th, 2001. Of course, massive terrorist attacks in the United States. We'll get into some of the details about that for about the first quarter of the show. Then the rest of it, we want to cover just the 20-year fallout of that on the American empire, both internally and externally. But I'm going to let the person who actually remembers it sort of guide this first quarter of the show in terms of the prelude to it going all the way back to the 90s up to like the 93 attempted attack or failed attack, I suppose you could say, through the 90s, through rise of Al Qaeda, Bin Laden, and the 2000s, and of course, just tracking the little pieces and details and going over some brief details of the attacks themselves and some conspicuous actors, both individual and state actors, who may or may not have been involved. But without further ado, I'll hand the reins over to you.
Yeah. Thank you. So, yeah, I suppose before I begin with this much broader timeline, I'll say just a few words about the day that it happened, and where I was, and uh, let's say how I felt that day, and how it all uh, began. So I was going to work that day, and on the elevator going up to the office where I was working, um, I overheard in the elevator uh, some guys talking about uh, a plane or an explosion inside one of the twin towers, and they said it was like a movie. I remember literally hearing that. Oh my God, this is like a movie. And so it was very odd. I get to work, everybody's very quiet. So this was just before 9. And then, not very long after, about 10 or 15 minutes past 9, the second plane, I believe that's the one that hit the North Tower.
I think it was South. South was second.
It was South, sorry. Yeah, you're right. North was first. And so we were in shock. Um, n- at that time, nobody really knew what was going on. I think after the second plane, everybody knew that these weren't accidents. This was intentional. And I remember like needing, I don't know, just a break. And I had gone downstairs, and downstairs, there was like a magazine shop where you could buy snacks, magazines, cigarettes, that kind of thing. And they had TVs everywhere. And I remember seeing the footage and seeing people trapped and just basically being overcome with grief. And I didn't. I couldn't help it. I began crying, and there were others in the shop that were crying as well. I returned back to work, and then I didn't even think it was 11:30 yet, and our manager just said, "Everybody, just go home. Be careful. Get home as soon as possible because there was a possible bomb threat in downtown Toronto. I was working in that area near the Royal York Hotel, and so, anyways, I just wanted to mention that how stunned everybody was, and you know, people debating about what had happened, who was responsible, and so on. So now I'll go into the background, and I'm just going to stress that this is not going to be like elaborate. We're not going to go through all the details, and we are definitely not dealing with like really wild stuff because that doesn't answer the question of who. It focuses on what, and what is a distraction. So we'll refer to you to go to Ryan Dawson's either BitChute channel or his Odyssey channel because there's no one who has researched this better than him. And he's a former guest of ours, who was on the show in the late summer of 2018, and that's
2019.
the 2019, and he to me is the authority on this. He's the one who took out the FISA on the 28 pages of the Saudi involvement well before the public announcement of the redacted version of that. He has the testimonies of Septemberelli, the woman who phoned the police about the 6 dancing Israelis. Actually, there were 3. The other 3 were implicated later when their van was pulled over. So he has a wealth of information. But let's start with 93. And I should say that the CIA and the FBI were well aware of these plans as far back as 1990. Definitely by 93, when the first attack on the towers was instigated.
And just keep in
There
mind,
was
throughout all of this, you had the upsurge of Al Qaeda attacks on American embassies, of course, the USS Cole in October of 2000. So it's not like Al Qaeda was this unheard of group at this point.
right, and yes, and I wanted to get to that. That there was also the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, where U.S. military was stationed. Well over 100 people, well over 100 soldiers died. Not since Beirut, and I remember Beirut, where like over 150 were killed. Not since that happened had anything like that happened before. So, but let's return to 1993. You can, if you can find it, the New Yorker had an article about this. I believe it was their February edition. I could be mistaken, but it was in 1993. And in a way, it is a X-ray of how these ops work. People are already very familiar with them, but I'll go through it anyways because in 2001 they weren't really that familiar. So the story begins with an ex-Egyptian intelligence officer who joined the FBI. His name was Salem, and his immediate upper, like his officer that he uh, dealt with, answered to, uh, was a guy named Antitsev, who was a former Russian uh, or Soviet intelligence officer, and he was recruited. So basically, what they had done is they had figured out that there was a cell that was planning an attack on the World Trade Center. If I'm not mistaken, this was in New Jersey. And the interesting thing is, just before the attack, Salem knew like that they were serious, that they were going to do this, and he begged Antitsev to replace some of the ingredients with flour. So instead of the actual ingredients that would cause a bomb. There were other attacks that were meant to happen. One was the Washington Bridge, but that didn't happen. Um, in any case, so they rented a Ryder truck, and the truck, you know, it blew up, and it caused severe damage. People died, but it, of course, wasn't anything like what had happened on September 11th. Now, the interesting thing is, Salem did not trust Antitsev. He did not trust his immediate uppers and even people above them. So he recorded everything. And again, this gives you a snapshot of how more willing the media at that time was to be critical. Because, in my opinion, the shift between, let's say, the current left had not fully taken power and was interested in being critical when it came to the media reports. Uh, and that kept things in balance. Nowadays, of course, you won't find that. And anybody who will watch some of the footage from 9/11 on the day of, will see this abundantly. No less when one of the newscasters, I don't know if it was CBS or not, uh, when he spoke about the six Israelis, the so-called six dancing Israelis were imprisoned, he led with a story about Jonathan Pollard, who, of course, had been thrown in jail. He's free now. I think it was Blumph who let him out in a
Yeah,
deal.
suspended his sentence, and he was welcomed with honors in Israel. And at that point, I believe they had thrown him in prison in the late '80s, so
Yeah,
he hadn't been in that long.
right, right. And so Salem had recorded all of this, and it was really because of that that nothing horrible happened to him, let's say. And then the article, in a sense, saved his life. So, um, to kind of wrap it up, at least this part, this American intelligence was already aware of these people. They were aware where the funding was coming from, and that New York was the primary target of these attacks well before 9/11. And of course, yes, I remember before it happened, I thought actually of Al Qaeda. I mean, I even thought it could have been a different terrorist group that wanted to get even with the U.S. or whatnot. Um, but Al Qaeda was something that crossed my mind. And as you said, there were the two attacks on the U.S. embassies in Africa. Um, I wish I could remember which ones there were.
Nairobi was one of
Uh,
them. I can't remember
yes,
what was it?
that's
Dar al Islam, maybe, or like whatever the capital of Somalia is. Did we still have a diplomatic presence in Somalia at that point? I can't even remember.
I don't know, but I don't think it was in Somalia.
It was somewhere in East Africa.
Yeah,
I know that because it was Kenya and it was somewhere else in East Africa, not Somalia.
it might have been Nigeria. No, it wasn't
Um,
Nigeria. Oh, anyhow,
either way.
so these attacks were becoming more frequent. So from '93 to 2000, there were at least four very high-profile attacks. These were massive attacks, dozens and dozens of people getting killed. Like at the embassies, like you literally saw the building crumble. Um, so they were horrific. I remember those images. And then USS Cole, of course, 17 sailors died in that attack. So it wasn't really a surprise. And there were all kinds of anomalies, such
And
as
I mean, I think
that
that
day.
coal is probably the most prescient precursor to that because it was, again, a explosives laden small boat that was just driven in the side of it in a suicide
Yeah,
mission. I mean, which
that's right.
again, where have you heard that one before? Whereas these other ones, of course, it was other methods. I don't believe that the other two involved the death of the attackers, at least in that sense. But again, at this point, by 2001, and just a fun little tidbit, Bush's National Security Council didn't bring up the threat of Al Qaeda until September 4th, 2001, to the president. And with that being said, this is a no win situation for the U.S. security apparatus, for the American security state, because it's either A, you knew about all of this and you were complicit in it, or you were arrogant enough to let it happen, or B, this happened all on your noses, proving that you're completely worthless and incompetent. So there was really no winning narrative to spin there. And again, of course, in the initial shock and fear of it, a lot of people weren't in the mental state to raise those points. But I think as time went on, again, what rationally, at least in my opinion, should have happened after a major attack like that is the top brass should have been fired at best or put on trial at worst.
Right. But you see that doesn't happen in America, even with today's scandals, like the pullout out of Afghanistan. So, so just the basic points of interest about 9/11 and where the evidence directs us to answer the question of who rather than what, because I think the what part, of course, is a distraction, right? You get all kinds of people obsessing over, like, what does it take to melt steel? The planes were really just a hologram.
Just
No
very
plane
like
hit the Pentagon.
semantic things like, oh, like again, missile hit the Pentagon, or what if they shot down Flight 93? What if it was out of Dayton Air Force Base? All these like things that are frankly, look, I wouldn't be surprised if the official narrative isn't true, but are really just minutia compared to where the actual
Yes,
story is.
right, right. So we know that on the morning of September 11th, several witnesses saw three men rejoicing after the first plane hit one of the towers.
Conveniently, the media
Uh,
called them Palestinians.
yes, yes, yes. Um, so, uh, so they were seen jumping up and down, lighting their lighters, uh, just generally rejoicing and dancing around. That's where they got the moniker, the dancing Israelis. And they were working for um, a company called Urban Moving Systems, and there were four other companies or five other companies underneath that. One of them, which was White Gloves. White Gloves was the one that one of the attackers used to move. The owner was a guy named Dominic Secker or Dominic Sutter. Dominic Sutter. He fled literally that day and got out. Now, employees that worked for him said that they had meetings only in Hebrew. That they were overheard saying, "Give us 20 years, we'll take over the media in this country," and all kinds of other things indicating very un-American or anti-American sentiments. So these three were caught, but they were caught with their other three accomplices. And if you think these are just stories, well, the Jewish publication The Forward admitted that five of the six were working. Well, we're here on a Mossad mission, and the only reason they were caught, and they were caught so quickly, was another neighbor, the woman who phoned them. Her last name is Septarelli, and the other woman who had noticed this, because she called her neighbor, and her neighbor took down the license plate, and they were caught in East Rutherford, New Jersey. And the first thing that came out of the mouth of the driver was, "Listen, we're not your problem. The Palestinians are your problem. Hamas. This is an attack that Hamas did." Then they lied and said they weren't there. They didn't. They were in New Jersey, across the Hudson, at Doric Towers. They had climbed on the roof to film all of this, and it was actually their filming which undid everything. They had a video camera, and they had a stills camera, and it was a stills camera that now nobody found the video. The video camera went missing. However, the still camera, its evidence was preserved, and it showed that they were filming at the time that they said that they were in Manhattan, at the other side of the city, and so on and so on. So that didn't pan out. They were all lying. They were detained for over 70 days. I remember it was around mid or late November that they were released. There's also the case of another van that was pulled over with bomb making materials. And that was suspected that might be used to blow up the Washington Bridge, or one of the other bridges that link Manhattan to New Jersey.
And of course, throughout the duration of the day, and of course the several weeks going onward, and you'll get into some of the anthrax stuff, there was constant media buzz about X, Y, or Z was spotted outside of this large building or this monument or this very important place. There's an unmarked van. Oh, there's this suspicious package, or there's these suspicious people, or whatever. Of
Yeah.
course, so there was no way, and really, it was a precursor to the modern media climate when it comes to these sort of
Yes.
breaking news events where you can't get straight information, where pretty much everything they put out at first is retracted, not only retracted, but the complete opposite of what they said at first. And of course, there were examples before that, but I would say between the meeting of that sort of event and where technology and communications were at that point. That was really the start of it. And
Mhm.
of course, it's only accelerated since the technology has improved over the past 20 years.
Right, that and shorter attention spans, which is why they put up false headlines and then retract them a few weeks later. It I mean, it's already mission accomplished because people will not, um, around the water cooler, people aren't going to say, well, that's been debunked. It won't change their minds anyways. Um, so at the time, there were also 60 Israelis that were questioned and detained. Two of the six dancing Israelis were already on an FBI watch list. They also helped. It was the two brothers that helped one of the attackers move down to Florida, or they followed him to Florida, and that's where higher level Mossad agents like literally live next door to this guy. Um, there are two others that are implicated that have ties that were also monitored. There were the two brothers that were attackers, not the Mossad guys, in Flight 77. So that's the one that hit the Pentagon. But the guy that I'm talking about, I believe he was on Flight 93. That's the one that fell out
Shanksville.
of the sky in Pennsylvania. So we know that there was some kind of foreknowledge, very detailed foreknowledge. Some of these guys were followed; they were being kept track they were in Germany. But of course, the other who is the Saudi connection. So the Saudi ambassador to America at that time had, generally very good relations, but it was his wife who began depositing money to a guy named Bimoni, another guy named Bessan. They were both Saudis, and they knew some of the attackers. One of them, again, moved to Florida. He lived with them for a month and then moved a little ways from there. So all of these guys were being tracked. And again, go to Ryan Dawson's BitChute channel, RyanDawson. You're going to get I mean, we just feel like people should know about this, but you're going to get a more concise and better message, a better understanding rather than from us. And he was
Of
also on
course.
Red Elephants last year, and he will go into far greater detail than we will. So of course the CIA knew that this ambassador's wife was funding through intermediaries the terrorists in an indirect way, usually with only one person separating them.
And this
Okay.
went towards pilots training, what they called dry runs, where they would fund them to go on
Yes.
other flights and pretty much scope out what it's like inside a 767 jet and what the cockpit security is like. And
Right.
those were the two big ones that they had funded. And maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit here, but it is convenient that, of course, there's all these intelligence ties from Israel, from the CIA, even from Saudi Arabia at this point, that just so coincide about 3-4 years before this document was put out, called the Project for a New American Century Clean Break Memo, that more or less calls
That's
for
right.
states we would need a new Pearl Harbor to inspire the American people to action, to inspire them to take up arms and go fight another war overseas, because they're very skeptical and they won't really have the energy or the heart to do that unless they feel they've been personally affected. And what better way to personally affect them than to have 3,000 of their countrymen drop dead from an attack?
Right. And really in the most horrific way, because it was played over and over and over and over
And it's not even
again.
like these,
And I
I
think
mean, okay, Pentagon aside, and even that's debatable because of how many civilian workers there. These weren't
yeah,
military targets, so it was worse than Pearl Harbor in a way, because that was an established Navy base in the Pacific, pretty much on Japan's doorstep. So it was more liable to attack. And you can get into some things about, well, was Pearl Harbor allowed to happen by. But again, I would like to discuss that at some point, just not this episode. But
Yeah.
again, just like having pretty much the center of commerce, New York City, the World Trade Center, the center of American might, and who knows where 93 is going, somewhere in Washington. Probably either, again, Congress or the White House, again, centers of American political power. These very symbolic attacks of this empire that had just won both, 2 world wars and the Cold War in the past century, mind you. And again, that's not even counting the mass civilian casualties and involved in all of this.
Right. And then there's also the question of the sprinkler systems, which had malfunctioned in the Twin Towers, and this too was connected with the moving company, the Israeli-owned moving company. I think it was called Zim. So it's probably changed by now, but the trucking industry in America is such that the place that the truckers go to get their licenses in Tennessee, because there you don't have to provide a social insurance number. And the FBI was already aware that they were like having, a lot of these licenses being issued. So they had a sting operation, and a woman by the name of Karen Smith that worked for the DMV there, she was implicated. She was like selling them. And so when they were arrested back in East Rutherford, they noticed that he had a ticket for having gone in to the Twin Towers on September the 4th or the 5th, even though, according to the Twin Towers Port Authority records, they had no legal reason to be there. So they had gone in there. And so, I mean, which makes this so egregious, is so vile and evil what they did. And of course, they were let go. But it shows you just, in many ways, how different America still was 20 years ago, that these guys could be held in jail for 71 days.
And beyond the legal side, getting into the public narrative side, Fox News, of all people, 3 months after the attack, ran a 4-part special, probably about an hour in total length, pretty much saying, well, we've arrested 60 Israeli nationals under the auspices of the Patriot Act. We have investigations on this company called Amdocs, which is based out of Tel Aviv, that handles the vast majority, I think something of upwards 90-something% of American telecommunications, at least at that time. They've probably diversified since. They've probably, of course, especially with mobile phones, have gotten a bit more creative. But again, and you could argue, you could do that, well, of course, it's a needle in a haystack. With all the millions of calls that they process, how could they keep track of these? But considering all the other information that was in charge of this, again, so you have not only that, but then the whole telecommunications Israel, and the fact that Fox News is willing to tell you about that, when I would say just 2 years later during the Iraq War, it's Israel is our greatest ally, we must stand with them at all costs. And that's another thing I'm going to get into later in the show, really how a lot of these events really help cement the sort of Zionist and even Jewish influence we see today, which I'm not saying was non-existent before then, but I would say really put it in its position of near hegemony that, again, so many people on this side talk about, but we'll get into that a little later.
Right. So there you have another example. And I suppose the last bit of detail that we should cover is the anthrax scare. So just some very quick points about it. When they looked at the composition, they knew that this was a modified form of anthrax that would have needed a very sophisticated kind of lab to do. And the first finger pointing at Iraq occurred around this time, saying it must have come from Iraq, right? Mohammed Atta must have met with officials from Iraq under Saddam Hussein's order in Prague. This was proven to be flatly false. Zero evidence, never happened. And it was Richard Pearl from PNAC that pushed this story. But what's interesting as well is that so two senators were targeted. I forget his name, but one Erdahl, like I think it starts with the E. So he was targeted because he had a bill to end funding for Israel. I'm not saying that was going to happen, but 20 years ago, again, just to show you how much things have changed, you could have something like that, and you wouldn't have an uproar about it. People
Israel
wouldn't
could still be rebuked before 9/11, and you want the most prescient example.
right.
Even Ronald Reagan did so when they attacked Iraqi nuclear reactors in the 80s when they were fighting against the Iranians.
That's right. That's right. This is still when America had some sway. America is an independent actor. It had, well, in a word, more sovereignty. And so these two senators are targeted with like real anthrax. And there was a writer, I want to say Judy, I forget her name. Now, she got a fake anthrax letter. And you have to understand, because the anthrax letters came about because a little bit later, around the 15th, 14th of September, because there were no flights for days after September 11th, and mail just stood still. And so people said this was a copycat attack. Well, how could you know it was a copycat attack? Because guess what? The first letter was not opened. The anthrax attacks, of course, used letters. The letters were doused with anthrax. So she got a fake one, and God, I wish I can't believe I forgot her name. I was just literally reading about her today. And in any case, she was friends with some of the guys in PNAC, but she was a very strong supporter of the war in Iraq. Later, she ended up going to prison for about 8 months because she disclosed a CIA program, and had basically that program had to be dropped, and it.
Wait, was she the one who was involved in the Scooter Libby scandal?
Yes.
Or my okay. What was I? Her name Valerie something, wasn't it?
Oh man.
Here, I'll look it up. I'll look it up.
Yeah. Hang on. I'm doing the same thing. Bear with us, guys. I'm really sorry.
Let's see right here. I'll know it when I see it. Valerie Plame.
Is that it?
Yes.
Because I know she was dating a guy.
Yes, just the excerpt from Wikipedia. I know, very academic source. Valerie Plame was an American writer, spy novelist, and former CIA officer. As the subject of the 2003 Plame affair, also known as the CIA leak scandal, Plame's identity as a CIA officer was leaked to and published by Robert Novak of the Washington Post.
That's right. That's right. And so that was so obviously, why would they send real anthrax to a senator that to a senator that wants to get rid of funding for Israel, and a fake one to a journalist who's all for attacking Iraq when there was no evidence for Iraq. So, anyways, that's just a very rough and very crude, I'm sorry, outline of just the major stories that around 9/11 and 9/11 itself that point fingers at who. And people ask, was our government just really stupid? It's like, well, I mean, governments make mistakes, but nobody makes this many mistakes. And whether we're talking about the 93 attack with Antitsev telling Salem to use, real, the actual ingredients for making the bomb instead of flour, or the notebook that was discovered at this New Jersey garage, like the fact is they were aware of these. And I could bring up FBI agent John O'Neill, who was working in Chicago, then moved to Washington, and he died in the Twin Towers. And of course, he was very adamant that an attack was imminent. and he was in Florida at a convention, and he got a call. He stepped away from his table and left behind his briefcase. His briefcase was taken. It was discovered, I believe, within 24 hours. It had not been opened, but he was reprimanded, and for that, he was sent out of the Washington office. Sorry, he lost his job with the FBI eventually, and because he was working on a case of another Al Qaeda attack in South Africa, and he was very sort of he was very forthright, and thought he could just take over the case, and this pissed off the South Africans because they felt he was arrogant, and the American ambassador to South Africa had problems with him, and the ironic thing is that he kept warning that something imminent was going to happen, and he got a job just, I think September 11th might have been his first or second day on the job, and he died in there. So there's actually a really good Frontline hour and a half special on John O'Neill that just came out recently. But I remember being engrossed reading about John O'Neill and who could have taken, because I personally believe that this was a sting operation to get him away from the briefcase so they could use it against him later. They wanted him out. He was probably getting already too close to understanding some of the machinations. So that is just to say that on some level, there were people within American intelligence that I think also knew what was going to happen.
Yes, and
or had a rough idea of even the day and some of the targets. I do firmly believe that. And I remember when I was talking about this, you had people that would ask me like, well, then what did happen? And I learned really quickly to just say, I don't owe you like a story about how it happened. You owe me a believable story. I'm not the FBI. I don't have 100 people working under me. I don't get paid $100,000 a year. Like,
no,
I don't have
100,000 rubles, on the other hand. We'll have to
Yeah.
ask Mr. Putin for a pay raise here.
Right. I don't have a lab. It's a bad faith question. Right. So I remember saying that. I go, remember, we're paying for them. They owe us at least a believable story. That's how it works. They're not a mob, and they're running a protection racket, and whatever they say goes, right? Like that's very basic. So anyways, those are some of the for our younger viewers that don't know, these are some tantalizing details that are worth looking up, and you can see them wrought out more fully by watching the Empire Unmasked, which a revision was done in late September 2019 by Ryan Dawson. That's his thing. That's his film. And he did a whole like 3-4 hour cast on just the Israeli and Saudi involvement in this. So anyways, that's all I'll say about some of the details. I think that's enough for as a lead.
Yes, and for now that we've covered the actual events and immediate fallout of the day, now we can talk about how it was projected long term and how things were affected. Now, I'll start within the internals of the empire, and then we'll move into the foreign policy, think Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East, etc. But just to start, of course, in the immediate aftermath of the attack, you had seen a national unity that hadn't been seen since the World Wars, if we're being honest. Bush had something floating in the, again, pretty much up until Iraq became a debate, his approval floating between 70 and 90%. We're talking like Putin levels of approval.
Yeah.
But with that being said, there were, again, cracks in the dam with the skepticism of Iraq, with the Patriot Act, with a lot of the security state measures. And, of course, I mean, this also plays into just really where the lines for I guess you could say the modern left wing and right wing were drawn today, because the right wing was very eager to rally around the flag, as were many Americans, but them in particular were eager to be the vanguard and say, look, we're the American nation. We have to stick by our traditional values. At that point, they'd probably call them Christian, not even Judeo-Christian at that point in values, and really assert ourselves and show pride in this nation that our forefathers built and that we built. And again, liberty, democracy, all the regular platitudes. So they expressed what you'd much more traditionally consider nationalism. I think the more striking contrast is some of the narratives you got on the left, because of course that isn't an attitude the American right has had, especially in wartime. Like, yeah, you look at again the cultural environment around something like Vietnam is a good example. You saw, at least in my opinion, what happened, and of course I'm talking as somebody who's viewed this all as secondhand information, somebody who's looked back after the fact, because of course I don't remember the actual events. I'm far too young for that. You saw this really growing, I guess you could say, secularist activism on the left. Not that the American left wing was ever particularly Bible beating or like devoutly religious, but again, there was always at least a tolerance or a passive acceptance for it. But you saw, of course, in the figures like, for example, the new atheist movement is irrelevant they are today. Thinkers like Christopher Hitchens that. Well, of course, the problem with this is we are stuck in our retrograde ways. We're still, of course, the Muslims are also a backward civilization. They're much more backwards than us. But hey, we have our own problems too. If the Muslim extremists can be like that, why can't our Christian fundamentalists be like that? And you saw for years after 9/11, it's like throughout the Bush era,
Right.
the caveat every time you talked about Islamic terrorism or Osama bin Laden, you had to mention again the OKC bombing or some other alleged right-wing incident from the 90s or whatever. Or, look at these statistics. Now, of course, a lot of that narrative has just changed to more so, again, on the racial level, anti-white, etc. But you really saw where this grew out of again, the idea that as a response to this, we must become a real secular liberal civilization. We must fight for women's rights in Afghanistan. We must tackle human rights abuses and dictatorships in Iraq and Syria and Libya, etc. And again, you sort of like the interventionist left grew out of that, as you saw. And again, that's getting into the cultural narrative and just briefly touching on where the lines of left and right were drawn and how those paradigms are either upheld or smashed in recent years. Of course, Donald Trump. I'm sorry, my dog is a live studio audience, but with of course Donald Trump smashed a lot of that paradigm on the right at least, and of course as the left has devolved, you've seen similar things. But just to briefly touch on that. But really, I would say the biggest cultural impact of September 11th was it was a moment where people had lost confidence in the government. Just based on all the things we said before, and of course that took 20 years to come out as we're recording this now. What we have here is people realized, okay, either our government is not capable of protecting us, or they quite literally threw us to the wolves and let us be fodder for whatever this attack was because they had some ulterior motives. Now, I think at first, after the initial shock wore off, people realized, well, like, and this was also part of it, well, the government can't protect us. How are we safe? Again, we've been told our entire lives that America is the safest country in the world, and that it's one of the reasons we're so great, because foreign adversaries can't touch us on our own soil, which, I mean, geographically, for the most part, is true. For example, you look at during, again, the barbarity of the 20th century and the absolute cataclysmic conflicts, again, mainly referring to the world wars, it was only in World War II you had brief Japanese occupation of some American territorial islands that, again, housed how many American citizens were, how many American citizens, I don't even know at that point. But point being is, it really shattered this idea of, and I would say not ridiculous idea of American invincibility that, like, well, of course, our soldiers might get killed, of course, our diplomats might be casualties in attacks, but the American populace, we're not like the Europeans, we're not like the Middle Easterns, we're not like the Asians. We can't be touched by war, we can't be touched by violence and terror. And that all of a sudden just was shattered in an instant, within a single day. And of course, that also led to what we saw, that this empire that had just really won the game of the 20th century, as I was saying previously, had come out on the winning sides of both world wars, especially World War II, influenced the affairs of half the globe, and gradually, especially at the collapse of the Soviet Union, which took place less than 10 years before 9/11, mind you. It was
Yeah.
this sense that we had conquered the world. And I would say a lot of people attribute that to American arrogance. Possibly it is arrogance, but when you have that many successes as a nation, as an empire, within the span of, at least thinking generationally, a century isn't that long, it isn't an unrealistic idea that you think, well, we're on top of the world and we can't touch us and it's clear skies ahead of us. And again, for that to be shattered in an instant, I think to this day did an irreparable amount of damage to the American national consciousness, to the American psyche, to the point where, again, even I don't think we're capable of recovering because number one, too many people remember are still alive. Number two, the generation that grew up without a memory of 9/11 are so detached from that America. In my opinion, at least, there's really no way to recreate that. I would say, just to put a, just to put a wrapping to this point, that September 11th, 2001 wasn't the day the American Empire died, but the day we passed the point of no return. And you can see that in every aspect, in our foreign policy, in our internal culture, in our immigration policy. I mean, immigration has only increased since 9/11. And keep in mind, this was an
Right.
attack that was carried out by people who had arrived here within 4 years of the attack, whether that be on, again, temporary visas or citizenship. And again, you want more detail about that, as you were saying, Ryan Dawson, about how these people actually came into this country and how these rings actually infiltrated this country. And of course, Bush
Right.
campaigned on amnesty and was very lax on immigration, sort of taking that middle of the road ground. And of course,
It was literally the attack that ground his amnesty to a halt. It was literally that. But
yeah,
he wanted to give amnesty just the way Reagan did. So there goes that idea that, oh, Republicans, I mean, maybe now, but Republicans are very gung ho about amnesty back then.
yeah, and it was a real shift. You look at some of the weird immigration debates in the '90s, where again the most right wing position we have today is what Bill Clinton had in the '90s. But that's
Yeah.
aside the point. But again, I just getting to the point where, like, beyond just the sheer amount of human cost, which I am in no way trying to downplay, as I'm sure any of you who regularly watch this show would know, I think even beyond that, even beyond the disasters that is our foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, what the biggest fallout of 9/11 is to this day is the fact that it it did a psychological blow to America that cannot be recovered again for the two reasons I laid out. The generation that experienced it, they can never go back, and then the generation that didn't experience it has no frame of reference for America
Right.
pre 2001, for the America of the 20th century, if you will, which was really, if you want to talk in objective standards, of course, there are many problems, social problems especially, was our golden age. Again, you can't rebuild that. You can't rebuild that American empire that was presided over by, again, the World War II generation, the greatest generation, as they call them, because again, I would say it wasn't the day America died, but it was the day that pretty much should have been, and I think in retrospect is much more clearly, should have been the sign that we're not long for this world, at least in the way that we have, and that the American empire is not going to be this long-lasting force that, say, I don't know, maybe the British, the French, or the Spanish Empire is. The fact that, again, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, that if that can happen to us, if that can shatter pretty much our entire national mythology, at least in terms of how safe and free we are, and again, that's also getting into the security state measures that were implemented post 9/11, then really the American mythology, at least of the 20th century, is dead now, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could another way to look at it is, let's say you map out a kind of thing, and even Moldbug brings this out, but there have been others. The talk about how every single instance that it looks like that America's getting weaker, it actually gets stronger. I'm not going to bring this up in order to argue like a point against you, but I because I generally agree with you. But let's say we're talking about America during the Civil War. That was the greatest amount of carnage that Americans faced, and it was at the hands of other Americans. Did that make America weaker or stronger? Objectively, it made America stronger. Let's say World War One, a war that America did not want to get into, and this is really when it's pivotal. Although the points I'm going to make about World War One are contained, their seeds are contained in the Civil War, and that is America before going into World War One still had very strong isolationist sentiments, extremely strong. They did not want to go to war in Europe. And, they had to be dragged into it, and they did. And however bad that was, and of course, America did not suffer the kind of losses that the Europeans did. But did that make them weaker or stronger? It didn't. It made them stronger. And it made them, the inevitable superpower, arguably even before World War II had begun. Now, the point that I wanted to make about how the seeds of World War One create a certain kind of, let's say, government psychological game or nation building, or not doing well with words today, but basically what I'm trying to get at is America is was being weaned to become a global empire rather than just a regional empire, right? And the idea is basically this, that in order to go from regional empire to global empire, sentiments of nationalism, regionalism, isolationism had to be destroyed. Now, what that does is it destroys the morale of a people, right? A fine example of this is Vietnam. And again, did Vietnam make America weaker or stronger? It made America stronger. Now, of course, all these things have limits. America literally had to float the dollar. I mean, it made sense in some ways to float the dollar on oil instead of on gold, but that's what it had to do, and it forced it to have always a very strong and intimidating military in order that people would accept this dollar as well. To say nothing of, like, let's say, facilitating security for all the shipping routes around the world and so on. So what you see is a gradual development where the people in America have to be weaned to not be satisfied with only having been a regional empire, because that's what they were. In a sense, America was only a country for a very short period of time. It was always, throughout most of its history, America has been an empire. They don't look at it that way because it didn't have very many good rivals. It didn't have, like, a people that were all that hard to conquer.
Like you
But
said,
essentially, that's
the
what.
deadliest war we've ever fought was against ourselves.
Right. So, um, so now we see that what is being developed is a kind of psychology that the Americans need to have in order to become a global empire, and that is that you cannot be isolationist, you cannot be nationalist, you cannot be nativist, especially nativist, right? You have now a global role to fulfill. And but the catch with this program is that when you do that, right? When you do that, you are going to have a more difficult time in getting people ready for the next war. How do you do that, right? Because every time, because you're quote unquote losing wars. You quote unquote lost Vietnam, right? But you got stronger, right? Now, obviously, some of this is because Vietnam is is portrayed as a war of necessity rather than a war of opportunity. It was always a war of opportunity, not necessity. The war for Russia during World War II is a war of necessity. If you don't defeat the Germans, it's over for you permanently, or for several centuries or generations. You will have to have another war in order to liberate yourself, right? That's a war of necessity. And that would be true for some of the other European countries that were involved in World War II. These are wars of necessity. They're not wars of opportunity, right? Vietnam
Again,
is a
like
war of
this is the one where defeat, so-called, would have cataclysmic consequences. Like if Germany won either world war, we'd live in a much different world. Whereas if the result of Vietnam was different, for example, if America pulled off even a Korea tier victory in Vietnam, where we just split the country in half, probably not much would have changed to where we are today. Now, you could argue the
yeah,
psychological effects on the American empire and the American population might be different, but again, it's a very slight deviation compared to what would have happened had, again, uh, Europe been put
mm,
under a German hegemony, whether that be in the 1910s or in the 1940s.
right. So now what's beginning to develop, and you can see this, you can see the extreme hesitancy to enter World War II. And you need a spectacular attack to rouse everyone up out of their isolationism. So they're woken and shook out of their isolationism to go on the other side of the world to fight a major war there for World War I, and they're going to have to be roused again. Right now, in all wars, the other side is dehumanized. A great injustice has been committed, and so on and so on and so on. But the interesting thing about how World War II begins is, you know, America's America's Pacific Fleet, its major naval base, was in San Diego, and it was moved just 6 months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And of course, I mean, we're not going to get into it, but there were warnings that the attack was imminent. They knew it would come. So a spectacular attack always becomes necessary, right?
And again, that's even going
When
back into World War One with the Lusitania and the German submarine warfare, the U-boat warfare, and then even further back with the USS Maine, which sparked war against Spain in order to bring Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico under the American sphere. So this is something that's been implemented. I would say Spanish-American War is probably the first real example you can think of. Again, the first real American Imperial War. Again, it's always been something that you've had to bring home. And the distinct difference, with the exception of some of the stuff with World War One, is it was particularly military targets. And again, Gulf of Tonkin with Vietnam is another one. However, again, September 11th, 9/11 was one of these ones that was on such a grandiose scale, especially with the level of civilian casualties compared to the level of military casualties, that it really took it to a whole new level. It was really the apex of these sort of events, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. And so anyways, so I guess what I'm trying to say is you can see how uh, there's always this tug between fighting a war of necessity versus fighting a war of opportunity. There's always a tug between fighting a war at all that's somewhere else, and then fighting essentially a war uh, for the empire, right? Instead of a war for protecting the homeland. Um, and in every instance, right, what you have to do is you have to make the attack on America ever closer and ever more spectacular than ever before. And I posit that is what they deduced would need to happen for for the new American century. Essentially, that's what I'm arguing for. This is how, in other words, we got where we are, right? Um, where does it go from here? Now that 20 years later, America has left Afghanistan, the only talk I hear is that there's an enemy within. And of course, the enemy is basically, you know, kind of like isolationists, wouldn't you say, right? Um, so this is sort of like, is this the last frontier? Of course, we're just speculating here, but it does seem that way. It does seem that in this process, that is what's next. That is what has to happen. And who knows? Maybe this vaccine mandate will be one of those things that pushes things in that direction. I don't know. Um, it's still very early, but that is what we've been primed ever since January the 6th. And we know that there were a lot of FBI agents, and uh, you know, the, like there was a lot of opportunity to stop this from ever happening in the first place by having a proper amount of officers there. So staffing, which was an issue with Pelosi, she was asked twice, and at both times she rejected the idea that more police would be necessary. So that's a little something I wanted to mention.
Oh, I do think it's a good point, and again, I think two things can simultaneously be true. Where America has gained strengths in its defeats, however, while that may have been a trend over the past century, it isn't a given rule, and I think there's been some major miscalculations in the past 20 years that may make 9/11 possibly the first exception to that rule. I'm not even going to go as far as to say that. I think it takes something beyond that. Another, again, American bumbling in order to really show the exception to that rule. Another American defeat. And who knows, Afghanistan may be that. We'll see how we come out of Afghanistan, but I doubt it's going to be stronger. But I do think it's certainly interesting to bring up how a lot of these defeats have been very quickly turned around into victories. And again, a
Right.
lot of good points there. And Moldbug, love him or hate him, on his analytical stuff, he's, in my opinion, very good, and it's certainly worth checking out him insofar as that is concerned. But I suppose since you brought it up, we should move into just a so-called brief overview of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 20 years, and really where American foreign policy entered into the embarrassing state it is today. Now, of course, as we were saying before, America had been interventionist power since the end of World War II, arguably even before then, getting into really the nascent American empire in the late 19th, early 20th century. But with that aside, you had Vietnam, which was, again, what many people consider a failure. You had a lot of the behind the scenes stuff in the Cold War for all the various proxy wars where, again, there may have been victories that turned out to have unintended consequences. You could say even Afghanistan with the rebels we funded there, or again the in some cases intended consequences. You look at our policy in Latin America backing these various groups and various conflicts and civil wars, which just so happened to coincide with massive amounts of drugs entering into America, completely unrelated, by the way. And again, so you have this string of mostly American successes with a few very notable failures. But I think the probably the best place to springboard into Iraq and Afghanistan is the first Gulf War with Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, where you have this absolute obliteration of what at the time is the fourth or fifth largest military in the world at the hands of a handful of coalition forces using mostly air power and technology to overwhelm a numerically superior force with minimal casualties. I think, in fact, some of the most notable casualties from the coalition forces out of the Gulf War were either blue on blue or green on blue incidents, which is either, again, friendly fire in the most literal sense with American against American, which, again, of course, is by accident, at least in this case, or green on blue, where it's an American ally, usually something like, again, Afghanistan is chock full of these. For example, the Afghan National Army would have some, again, friendly fire incident, hit an American soldier, whatever. But point being is, I think it set the stage, and that combined with Yugoslavia, that we could just wage these campaigns where we have to put in very minimal effort, mostly just air and technological power, and we can overwhelm these countries and bend them to our will. We can bring Milosevic to Dayton to sign a peace accord. We can push Saddam Hussein back into Iraq, and we can encourage uprisings with the Kurds and the Shias. And I think, especially in the wake of 9/11 and hopped up on, again, what is our understandable feelings at the time, this very rally around the flag feeling that we must bring our enemies to justice. They must answer for their crimes, whether that be in a courtroom or with their blood. I think people had this mentality that Afghanistan would be much the same way. We go, we kick down the doors of the current regime there, which is the Taliban. We find Bin Laden and the heads of Al Qaeda, and again, we either put them on trial or just sentence them to immediate execution. And then we declare victory and go home, similar to what we did, again, with the Gulf War in Iraq or what we did in Yugoslavia.
Hmm.
And of course, as time went on, nation building and building a democracy became the big selling point there. And then that's not even getting to Iraq, where Iraq you have, well, Saddam Hussein, he may be aiding and abetting terrorists, and oh look, he has this weapons of mass destruction program. What to quote Netanyahu, again, well, if you don't take out Saddam, and that's my best Netanyahu impression, we'll see how that goes. It might not just be a plane in New York, but a nuclear bomb. Like, but of course, I'm sure you've all seen his testimony in front of Congress talking about how it will create just this wonderful reverberations throughout the region where the the Iranians and the Syrians will see the Iraqi dictator topple and they'll be inspired to action to overthrow their governments and implement democracy. Now, of course, that didn't work. But maybe Syria did there for. Maybe it had a chance of doing that there just for a while, but no, that didn't work in an overall sense. But of course, Iraq came about. Well, we have to hunt down these terrorists and their collaborators. You're either with us or against us. With George Bush's acts of evil speech, you're either an ally or an enemy. And again, that also very
Yeah.
quickly became we must secure human rights and democracy and freedom for the Iraqi people. We have to prop up the Kurds and the Shias and the Sunnis and make sure all these various groups are. Of course, we'll have a multilateral democracy. We're certainly not playing ethnic and religious groups against each other to keep the country divided. No, that's not happening at all. Divide and conquer. That's stuff of British imperialism, not American humanitarianism, of course. And I'm sure, as you all know.
Right. Right.
But and it is funny you do get that contrast with all of that. But again, you had this. I think the way both Iraq and Afghanistan were sold was people had the Gulf War mentality. It's going to be quick, it's going to be clean, it's going to be easy, and we're going to come out on top of it. Now, I would say we've just gotten more and more bogged down because we ended up saying these countries, Afghanistan 20 years, Iraq just shy of 20 years, because even though the combat officially ended in 2011 and the mission against ISIS technically ended in 2017, so there was a brief period between 2011 and 2014 where America was technically not in combat in Iraq. We still had military presence there, and we actually just recently evacuated our military presence just in over the course of 2020. After the whole Soleimani debacle, we more or
Yeah.
less cut loose and run there. But again, I don't think even the most fervent, again, American jingoists, if you will, who were big supporters of Bush, big supporters of the wars, whatever, would have believed you or would have even supported the idea that we would be there for, you know, the better half of, a decade, pushing nearly on 2 decades. So,
Right. I mean, you do say a very interesting word about being bogged down, and it does seem like the next place that America is getting bogged down is in America.
I mean, certainly that's getting into this and getting into the internal disputes of the empire. And again, I will come back around to touch on that. But with that being said, and of course, after our stunning successes in Iraq and Syria by 2011, Iraq and Afghanistan, we're getting into Syria by 2011. We think, oh, of course we can take out Gaddafi with no consequences. And of course, Gaddafi's famous last words, quite literally, is you take me out. Look, I'm the wall between Europe and mass migration. In many ways, he was. He was keeping a lot of people who were, again, trying to cross in either from other parts of North Africa or through sub Saharan Africa. He was keeping them out of Libya. And of course, once that happened, the floodgate broke open. You saw that. And it is almost prophetic that Gaddafi died before the era of weaponizing mass migration. You see, for example, with mainly Turkey. I'd say they're the real
Hmm. Hmm.
pioneers of that. And of course, we take out Gaddafi, no consequences. Obama sheds his crocodile tears at the end of his term, saying, "Oh, if only we could have done more for Libya." You see, we still would have taken him out, but if only we had a plan to put their first gay black
Oh
president in
yeah,
there.
like he didn't
Yeah,
know.
like
Like I
yeah,
mean,
come
all of
on.
these guys knew. All you have to do is compare. Like, just look at what Cheney said in '94 compared to 2001. When he was asked after the first Israel, the first Iraq war, why didn't America just stay there? Like, this, of course, is the first war in America that dragged out, from 91 till like literally 2003. That's the one that was indirectly responsible for the death of 500,000 children by like literally one of the first things that they destroyed was the ability to water filtration
Oh
plants,
yeah,
right? And then they
yeah,
had,
like the constant airstrikes, the sanctions, and also not to mention, pretty much
yeah,
to use the analogy, giving spears to the Kurds and the Shias and telling them to go charge the machine gun line against Saddam's regime. Like, oh, of course we'll back you. Go get them. We'll
right,
support
right.
Iraqi democracy. George H.W. Bush comes out. But no, no, and I'm not saying that we should have, but I'm just saying we intentionally lured those people into their deaths in order to make Saddam look like an even more brutal dictator, uh, as it
Right,
goes.
right. And Cheney's answer was going to Iraq. That's crazy. We go in there, we're going to get bogged down. This is not a culture that we can really change. Um, the Kurds will go one way, it will fracture the entire country. Like, literally everything he said, all the reasons not to go in were reasons that were proven why, that would occur once going in. But you can tell by 2001, his tune is very different.
Oh, of course.
He's
Again,
he
these
changed his
people all
mind
knew it was.
completely.
And again, and then you get into Syria, which is really, I would say, the most recent example of America getting egg on their face, where this Middle Eastern dictator, of course, with the support of other powers like Iran and Russia, manages to fend off an American-backed insurrection against him. That again, between all the various groups, between ISIS and the other various resistance groups, takes over, I would say, a good 65% of the country at that point. Again, you have fighting the Damascus suburbs at that point, and it was looking like before Russia got involved, like in a real like hard sense in 2015, that it was more or less over for Bashar al-Assad, and that he was going to go the same way as Gaddafi or Saddam, or again be overthrown or be forced to flee the country. So you had that happen. You had again just the change in fortunes there, thanks to again mainly the Russian and also the Iranian intervention. So you had Syria being another example where we get bogged down. Of course, ISIS gives an excuse to put boots on the ground and operate in Kurdish areas we're still operating today. But again, what have these forces done really since the main fight against ISIS? They've just been there. The big joke has been they've been chased around by these Syrian military convoys. And
Right.
again, of course, I mean, the Arab Spring, all of this, all the modern climate of the Middle East, the political climate of the Middle East, is made possible because of the American interventions post 9/11. Yemen is another one. And of course, the Axis of Evil speech with Iran being implicated as one of the main sponsors of like discord and terrorism within the sphere of the world in the Middle East, saying, well, and yeah, it gets back into I think it was Wesley Clark's 7 countries in 5 years, as ridiculously ambitious as
Yeah.
that was. And Iran was the one they wanted to take out last. Now, maybe the biggest mistake of the neoconservatives, and I say this half-heartedly because their decisions from their point of view made sense at the time. Maybe they did make a big mistake not trying to implicate all of this, going back to 9/11 on Iran. Now, you've seen in these past few years, especially when you had the big debate over the Iran deal, late Obama and Trump, where, well, oh, don't you know that Iranian intelligence had ties to Al Qaeda and that Iran supported Al Qaeda in the lead up to 2001, blah, 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 blah. Like, again, all that sort of nonsense came out with that.
Right.
But, and it's also painted, again, just the landscape of the Middle East, and sometimes in a quite literal sense, where you could justify even just the most limited scale, for example, strikes on Syria or whatever, or intervention against ISIS, which of course, was the mess that we created in the first place. That these people are just like Al Qaeda. These people are just like Osama bin Laden. We need to really move to take them out. We need to move to protect the world and protect and stop ourselves from terrorism. Fight them over there so they don't come over here while importing millions of them on top of that. So on top of that, it gets into even more ridiculous territory. But I mean, I'm saying a lot of stuff that is probably obvious right now, but I think within the context of everything that we discussed, putting this obvious stuff in there really helps put the pieces together. And let me know if I'm off on that, if you think that this really came together well, because again, we've been working for a while to prepare this show, and I know there was a lot of ground to cover, a lot of information to go over, but again, and it's even hard to talk about the American role in the Middle East as a fallout of 9/11 because even though we've gotten out of Iraq and Afghanistan, it's still ongoing. Even though we have very few troops in Syria and very few troops inside the, for example, hostile Middle East. Now, of course, we still have tens of thousands on the Arabian Peninsula where we're generally welcomed by countries like Kuwait and kind of Qatar. Things have turned south there recently, Bahrain, etc. But again, it is hard to really put a finishing point on this one because it's still ongoing.
Right, right. And I think also we should talk about how the you brought up how these wars have actually brought in even more, let's say, refugees and changed and migrants as well. In a way, they piggyback on very similar foundations of intake of refugees. But when the war broke out, there was, for a lot of people, there was a kind of an idea of mixed messaging happening, right? Like libs back then would tell you that this war was for oil, even though like America didn't get the oil, China got the oil, and then a lot of the oil from the Kurdish region was being funneled into Israel, which was what was happening uh, during the outbreak of the war in Syria. But so you know, very soon after uh, the attack, and Bush had made his address to the American public. He would that's where you first heard this idea of Islam is a peace, it's the religion of peace, right? So the West is defining what Islam is, or America is defining what Islam is, when they've already had at that point over 30 years of growing these, whether it was the Mujahideen or Al Qaeda, like they literally grew these terrorist groups.
And also,
But they,
in terms of turning American consciousness to fear Islamic terrorism. Now, I'm not saying like, oh, we have to welcome Muslims to open arms or whatever. Again, I actually I think invade the world, invite the world is probably one of the worst things we've probably ever done as a country. But
yeah,
again, you like see like throughout like a bunch of like '80s action movies or like portrayals in the media or like Gaddafi in the '80s, this idea that or the Iranian Revolution. How could we forget about that one? Well, you see, Islamic radicalism is going to become a new threat, something that we have to work to address. And this is unlike previous centuries where, yeah, these hostile religious fundamentalist, anti-American, anti-Western forces are really starting to crop up all across the Middle East. Now, ignore the similar people who are in league with the West, like Saudi Arabia, who support a lot of this. And I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood was also another one that was really big in the 80s. That's when it
yeah,
really got support. Hamas is when that started to come up. So again, 80s, 90s, where really we spent a lot of the time stoking really not only the flames over there in terms of supporting these groups against X, Y, or Z actor, but also instilling in the American consciousness that these people are going to be the next enemy, only for in the immediate aftermath of a massive attack that they carried out. And of course, again, not like they carried out on their own. We went over that at the beginning of the show. We have to look. Not all of them. So many of them are peaceful and just like us. Just these few extreme radicals we have to point out. Even though we've been telling you that, we again, it's this complete 180 in narrative where it's like, oh, you have to be vigilant. And you have to be prepared against these Arab and Muslim terrorists. But then it's like, well, of course we can't implicate them all, and then are surprised when there's anti-Arab and anti-Muslim hostility in the wake of 9/11. After number one, stoking those sentiments, and number two, that event actually happening on their watch, mind you. And then they have to do this 180 because they want to bring a bunch of them in. They want to, for both ulterior motives and for these warped ideological motives, such as, again, this idea of liberalism and plurality. Like, for example, well, if we can't make them Americans over there, we'll make them Americans over here, is what it boils down to. Of course, that's more
Right.
laborers, that's
Well,
more tax, wage slaves, etc. But do continue.
right. So, I would say that there was a concerted effort, of course, to portray a kind of, I don't know, a kind of Islam that would function under a secular democracy, right? Like any empire, you can read what the Turkish Empire in the 19th and 20th century thought about, its religious clerics when they said we should be converting these people. You'll understand why a plurality of religions for some empires is preferable than just having one. In any case, uh, so so what they wanted to push really was, of course, the Patriot Act was already drawn up uh, before 9/11. It was basically done by 1999.
And in many
It
ways was
was
being unofficially done already, of course, and they just got the green light post
right,
9/11.
right. But a lot of that was done, of course, because of the Oklahoma attack, not just the Al Qaeda attacks that were happening at American embassies, the USS Cole, etc. Uh, and the other thing that should be pointed out is there was a coordination that was happening with the UK. Like, for the Afghan war, the Russians were on board. Putin met with Bush and said, we're here, we're to help. We can give you all our expertise in this region, in Afghanistan. And, Bush took it. When it came time to invading Iraq, of course, Putin was against it. France was heavily critical. Chirac said, you can't spread democracy in an armored vehicle. Germany was against it, so on and so
Turkey
on.
grounded our planes at Incirlik and wouldn't even let us conduct operations out of there in the wake of Iraq.
That's right. So none of them in the region or in Europe wanted this. They knew that this was a bad war. But the interesting thing is how Britain, even though the British Parliament was not for it, Tony Blair was absolutely gung ho. And Tony Blair really became I remember this, the articulate voice for the war in Afghanistan and later the war on Iraq. And
And
in
I suppose you're
particular,
going into the Condoleezza Rice speech with this?
I will, but not until I point out something that Tony Blair said just before the invasion of Afghanistan, and he said, like, he had this speech where he addressed on television the public, and there was an audience, if I'm not mistaken, and he said, he basically gave a George Bush Senior New World Order speech. He said, the kaleidoscope has been shaken, and the pieces are like floating about, and they can land in a certain way, and we can create a new world from this. So he was looking at this as a kind of a reset opportunity, right? I would say, overarching all of this, I would say that's still like not the top level um, interpretation of what's going on. If you understand that Afghanistan and Iraq are wars of opportunity, not wars of necessity, even though they must be portrayed as a war of necessity, right? Um, then the overarching idea, of course, the real war is actually going to begin in Europe and America, partly from invade invite, partly because the whole point of wrecking these places, the whole point of the rationale is, if we let, like, the terrorists or whatever win in those areas, we're going to have a more backward people trying to commandeer this wrecked landscape that's very sectarian or just outright already divided, and they're not going to become competitors, because in a highly technological age like we've had in the 20th century, if you don't advance, you get conquered. One way or another, you will get conquered. So I think these wars of opportunity they were meant to lose to an extent, but the cost to do this, like, required a sacrifice. Whether you're talking about demographics or whether you're talking about the day of 9/11, essentially you're talking about the same thing. And yes, and the interesting thing about Condoleezza Rice, who is an incredibly intelligent woman. She's very, very smart. Just go read her credentials. Um, she is not some flash in the pan. She is not some quota hire.
She's
And
not
she
Susan
did.
Rice, for example.
No, not at all. Not at all. This is a very, very astute, not just astute observer, but she's a theoretician, right? Because, like, when the war in Iraq broke out, she gave this condescending, pedagogical kind of speech to all the major players of the world at that time. She said, um, to the British, of course, we owe the greatest thanks because they're our closest partner and ally. The the Germans must be ignored. The French should be reprimanded, considering they too had a revolution. And the Russians are still young and naive. And that, in a sense, if people are familiar with Spengler, you know what she's talking about. She's talking about, like, basically the winter portion of of a civilization. And she's saying the West, as a family of these Western European countries, of which America is a part, Britain and America are that last stage. And France must be uh, punished. It must learn from its mistake because it knows better, because it has had a revolution. Germany must be ignored because it was in Germany, in mid 20th century Germany, the impulse not to go into the autumn and winter of the civilization was felt strongest for a short period of time. And Russia, who doesn't even belong in the system, is therefore too young to understand the process of what is happening here. It is. I remember 7 years ago is when I became familiar with Spengler, and when I happened on that speech again, I was amazed. But there you have it.
It really, it's
And it
probably
like the atmosphere.
like
The
probably up there
atmosphere was
with
very.
Kissinger and Brzezinski in terms of understanding of American foreign policy. Maybe even greater than that. And again, as much as I detest all three of
Absolutely.
those people, like it's honestly impressive. But do continue.
It is. Absolutely. And we should say the atmosphere was also different in many other ways. When they announced that they were going to build a mosque, uh, like, next to where the towers stood, people were up in arms. I mean, you had left and right opposed to this in Congress, no less. Even the ADL was against it. So that's just another, you know, something else to show you how different it was. Because back then, it like people really were fooled into believing, especially when they changed the criteria for the war, that it was really about to spread democracy, not find weapons of mass destruction. People really believed that, and they believed, like, yeah, of course they should come over. If so, a lot of what we have now was already put in work then. And as Uncle Thomas uh, put it a few weeks ago, the real war is here. And it is. This is shaping up to be like the last place to conquer.
Oh, naturally, and you could say again, harkening back to that Condoleezza Rice speech, really the grand finale of Western civilization, now, isn't it? It's that last iteration,
Yeah,
it's that last incarnation in the form of the Anglosphere that is, I would say, maybe this is a bit too far of projection, possibly, but I stand by
yeah,
it. In the last chapters, again, the last paragraphs, the last chapters, if you will, the point where,
right,
and again, in terms of grand schemes of things, we're probably talking decades, if not a century or two. But like I
yeah,
said, I hate putting time frames on things because you've seen how that turns out in the past. And overall,
yeah.
with how that happens is again, it's almost haunting. And again, looking at uh, who Condoleezza Rice is and the position she was in, pretty much saying, well, yeah, like this is the final act. This is, after this, it is done. And this is somebody who was supposed
Right,
to, who was part of this administration, particularly the Bush administration, that trumped itself up on, well, the new American century go forward, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, but again, pretty much painting this picture of, I guess, what you call finality to the whole thing. Again, I think that it is one of the most overlooked, underappreciated, and probably will go down in historical retrospectives as, again, very prophetic speech.
yeah. Very prophetic speech, and and that was still at the stage where there were some people on board that really thought that they could change Iraq and Afghanistan, that there would be massive payoffs for being able to do that. Not least of which, it would have added extra pressure on Iran, because ultimately, I think what they really wanted was Iran, right? Because if you look at the rationale, right, like if I destroy these countries or if I allow these countries to have like a religious leadership, it will thwart their development. In fact, this is why people have hypothesized that the CIA actually did want there to be a hostage crisis under Jimmy Carter, not so much to um, uh, um, uh, disgrace Jimmy Carter and his administration, but because it was understood that if that had happened, then Iran will lose. It will not be able to compete with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and it will probably be more antagonistic towards Russia. But what ended up happening, because there was a lot of left support for the Iranian Revolution. Even Michel Foucault supported it. There were a lot of people that were for it that were on the left, um, because there were leftists within the revolution, but the religious elements eventually took over. Now that would have been like welcomed, I suppose, by the CIA. However, what Iran has proved is that despite this conservative revolution, um, they've decided that they're going to have nuclear power plants. That the sanctions that they've been living with for nearly half a century, they're going to find technology, create their own technology as a way around it, and this is what has them scared. And I think this is also one of the biggest reasons why they were in Iraq and Afghanistan. um, they expected by being in Afghanistan that the Afghanis would have insurgents fighting Iran. That was one of the pieces of information that were disclosed, but that didn't happen. So there's other reasons why these two countries and what they wanted to accomplish there were failures. Now, they were profitable. There were a lot of short-term gains. We've discussed before the military-industrial complex gained from that experience, blah blah blah. Again, you're thwarting these areas from development. Everybody knows that innovation is the way to have some kind of sovereignty, just as much as having nuclear weapons guarantees you a certain amount of sovereignty. It's probably one of the reasons why, after the Soviet Union fell, Russia could still rise back up, because you know um, bullshit. Money, nuclear talks, bullshit walks. You could say. So I would say that that whole process backfired on them, and Iran has been able now, with diminished American forces in Iraq, it's actually projecting its power even more so.
Oh, certainly. And just the last thing I wanted to touch on these last few minutes here is the actual response to the 20th anniversary. Now, I remember I was a kid during the 10-year anniversary. Of course, that was within the same year that Bin Laden's assassination happened. Now, if you ask me, I think what assassinated Bin Laden was kidney failure, but we're not going to get into that right now. And I remember how, of course, jubilant the celebrations were, and how much of a more triumphant air that the 10-year anniversary of 9/11 had. That, well, yes, we've had this tragedy, but we've overcome. And I think as the wars dragged on, and especially as I got older and started to pay attention to more of these things, by again 2012, 2013, 2014, etc., it started to fade to the point where in 2016 the biggest story is that Hillary had that collapse at the memorial service, and then it seems like
Yes.
after that the American population has generally paid less and less mind to the remembrance of 9/11, to the event itself, and that it is more and more in the rearview mirror, despite the fact that we still have thousands of people, in fact, millions of people with distinct memories of it. And I would say thousands, if not tens of thousands, with like direct memories of it, who are actually within the attacks themselves, whether they had been again aid workers or any like the police or fire departments or um, paramedics, the people who were actually working in the buildings, the people who got out. Again, just in general, the people who were first-hand affected by it, second-hand, etc. But it seems like, of course, among the people who were directly affected, it's going to carry much more weight. But just in the American consciousness, at least from my observations, while people still do talk about, well, people are like, oh wow, it's been 20 years, or I remember where I was, etc. It seems like something that you would have expected to be a much more pivotal moment, a much more, I would say, significant moment, is really just like playing second fiddle this year to, again, of course, the Afghanistan debacle, which is linked to all of this. Of course, the new vaccine debates and
Hmm.
outrage going on with that. But at least in my opinion, it doesn't seem like what if you would have told me 10 years ago when I was a kid, like, oh, hey, 10 years from now when you're, a young adult and this is how people are going to respond to this. I wouldn't have believed, of course, talking to a kid of that age, you're not going to get the most accurate response or the best understanding of all that. But again, just in general, I do think if you told a lot of people, especially like right after the assassination of Bin Laden or the 10-year anniversary, that, well, 20 years from now, it's not actually going to be anything like this. It's going to be something that's sort of faded in the background. And well, of course, we'll see throughout the day tomorrow how the public consciousness reacts, just based on media, based on whatever in terms of that. But again, I think it also does play into that sort of national imperial decline, the fact that something like this has sort of been relegated to what seems like a second thought.
Right. And I think, Trump played a very pivotal role, as you say, in this developing sense of decline, right? Because just before Trump, you know, around the time that Trump announced that he would be running for the presidential office, Paul Wolfowitz and one other member of the PNAC group uh, were going to resurrect another pact for the new American century, right? But at this point, the American public, like anybody who was an adult when 9/11 happened, all that jingoism, all that pressure, particularly from the Republicans, to call anybody who wasn't as jingoistic as they were about more, supporting the wars in the Middle East. They were called a traitor. They were
Oh, the
un-American, so
the
on and
the
so on.
infamous, what was it, unpatriotic conservative article that National Review ran against people like Pat Buchanan and Tacky, and again, like all these people who were like stalwarts
Yes.
of American conservatism, who said, and not even like Afghanistan, but maybe diving headfirst into Iraq isn't a good idea, at least right now. And again, like you had more like staunch opposition to it, but some of them were saying like, oh, it's not even that we don't want regime change in Iraq, but like why now? The fact that again, like, and that's really when I would say you saw that real acceleration of the conservative movement, at least into what it is today, with that unpatriotic conservative articles, and really the seeds of Trumpism, playing on the whole Buchanan tendencies throughout the '90s and early 2000s, etc.
Yeah,
And
because
if you just want an idea, just as another side of how far the media narrative has changed, Patrick Buchanan used to be a regular on MSNBC. Think about that.
yeah, 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 and like when Trump said when Trump told Jeb Bush that his brother lied to America about the Iraq War, and I don't even know if it was directly about the Iraq War, but I think he was also hinting at 9/11. People were definitely reading into that he's also talking about a 9/11, that he was a liar.
I mean,
And
he
you
outright
couple
said the
that with,
towers came down on your brother. He used that exact phrase.
that's right, that's right, that's right. And so the lie was he's implicating that his brother was lying about 9/11 and lying about Iraq, or the reason for Iraq. Now, you couple that with his speech about NATO. Why do we need NATO? Why can't we work with Russia? Like, this is all literally decline talk. And people lapped it up. So that impulse to go back to just being a regional empire, right? Back to a more isolationist mode, right? Resurfaced right away. Uh, and I mean, Wolfowitz and all those guys were absolutely tone deaf in 2015 and 16, wanting to bring back PNAC. Like, that was over. Obama literally got elected. He literally got elected because of the war on Iraq and Afghanistan. And I say that because when he had that debate with Hillary Clinton and she's arguing for the war, she said, well, it's not a war. I mean, it's a question of diplomacy. He goes, what we're doing, you consider diplomacy? And people were backing him. I mean, of course, nothing happened. He started more wars, but when people witnessed that brought the majority of the crowd over to his side, and it was a no-brainer he was going to defeat McCain. That was obvious. So, in a way, that sentiment got people elected. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. Like, how much more this dynamic can keep going is going to be very interesting.
Oh, certainly. And again, I do think that with this, I think the actual events of tomorrow will give us a much clearer picture that we'll probably have to make a little bit of a follow up on, just touch on the public consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
where the pulse is. But I suppose that's all I had for this lengthy episode. Now that has been quite a
Yeah,
while in the making.
yeah. I mean, we had to. We probably could have gone another hour. But I think that, yeah, I think I've covered most of the basic points I wanted to make.
Oh, certainly. I think that we covered just about everything that is pressing. There are a few things I could bring up, but a lot of it would just be retreading on old grounds in new detail. But
Mm-hmm.
I just have to say, as somebody who can't even remember, it is wild to think that's been 20 years, and just what, in effect, one thing like that, again, not to downplay the human cost, just to reiterate that point, the effect that can really have on a nation and on an empire, and that it's really, again, probably the most pivotal event of the 21st century, a century that isn't even, again, that's just now entering into its third decade. And I mean, not only that, but just every major geopolitical event of the 20th century has, in my opinion, a direct tie to this, whether that be, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan. Those ones are very obvious. The Arab Spring, um, the Russian annexation of Crimea, even going to that, the rise of China, the murmurs on the Korean Peninsula about peace and negotiations. All of that, and I would say you could make a reasonable case. It's not only indirectly but directly able to be linked to September 11th, 2001, and the
Hmm.
immediate response to that. And it is almost wild to think that one mass casualty event can have that strong of reverberations that we are still feeling today. I would say, out of all of that, beyond, again, just looking at that, that's also another reason why I do think it is important to remember all these things and keep them in mind, just to realize that, like, this isn't just some tragedy that happened 20 years ago. It's something that we are living with the effects of today, and that we will continue to. Again, this had set the course for global politics, for geopolitics, for the rise and fall of civilizations for an entire century
Yeah,
at least.
yeah, yeah. I mean, even Obama getting elected, kind of flies in the face of the argument that America did it because it was a racist nation. Like, not 7 years after the attack, America, you know, elects a black man with the name Hussein. Like, I'm sorry, but that doesn't. That's not possible. And there's that meme of if America was really this white supremacist nation, uh, like what we would have had instead in the fallout of the attack on 9/11, we would have had like a huge import of like white Europeans and in
Yeah,
America
that,
in the
and
mid
again,
century.
the George W. Bush, had he wanted to, had the political capital. Now, of course, this would have been
Yeah,
a contradiction of his previous amnesty. Had the political capital to probably shut down 90% of immigration for the next several decades, if he wanted to. The GOP
yeah,
had that, and this is how it turned out. It really, I would say, put America into terminal liberalism, and that's really, I think, the most that can be said about
yeah.
it.
And you're right. You make a very good point to remember the losses. I'll disclose something that day. I didn't necessarily get along with these other guys there. And I said something like, "Well, it's blowback," and they said, "Fuck you, man." It was that kind of thing. And I think it's when I saw footage of the second tower, and I began crying in this magazine shop um, that it really was a very, very horrible thing that happened. And it affected us in a very big way. And then the war in Iraq was just this sinking feeling like this is just not going to end, and it's only going to bring more suffering. So it's good to remember that. And you know um, if I have any regret, is that I didn't I didn't say, like, I probably shouldn't have said that. That's too soon, because it was. And yeah, those people in those towers didn't. They're not in charge of American policy, and they don't. They would probably disagree with it probably 80% of the time, anyways.
I mean, really just cataclysmic, and again, I think just the last point I'll make before we go on, before we cross the 2 hour mark, is that, again, it's just something that, because of all the reverberations in every aspect of life, you simply cannot escape. It is simply again, you can have remembrances of other tragedies or anything else, even in recent history, even major terrorist attacks. Think, for example, Paris 2015. But Paris 2015 didn't get the ball rolling on literally everything we see going on in the world today. Again, it's just, and as somebody who doesn't have those memories and who does this kind of show, that's like what really gets me thinking, and like what really gets like me in that sort of introspective mood. But I don't know about the rest of you. I hope we put together a pretty good summary of all of that, and again, of the fallout of it, Of course, we could go on for another 3 hours probably, but I'm going to make the executive decision that we should probably bring this to a close now. So,
Yeah.
thank you everyone for tuning in to this very big episode. I know we hyped and teased it for a while there, and we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Yeah. Take care, guys.